My mother ordered me to cancel my bus ticket 2 days before my sister graduated from an Ivy League university. She claimed my discount shoes would embarrass them before wealthy donors. I mailed my gift and vanished. 5 years later, on that exact campus, my parents sit in the front row to protect their golden child. They have no idea the woman stepping to the microphone to bury their fraudulent empire is the daughter they erased. My name is Tessa Mills, and I am 27 years old. My feet felt like lead as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Harbor Point Suites. My night shift as an auditor had just ended, leaving me with the familiar ache that settled deep into my bones after 8 hours of standing, pacing, and staring at numbers. The harsh morning light of suburban Philadelphia offered no comfort as I walked the 6 blocks to my cramped studio apartment. The air was biting, a typical harsh morning, but I hardly felt the cold. My entire focus was anchored to the small, heavy object clutched to my chest. It was a navy blue gift box, tied with a crisp silver ribbon. Inside rested a premium, full-grain leather portfolio. I had run my fingers over the custom engraving just hours before. The initials BM were stamped into the leather in elegant, quiet gold. It was for my younger sister, Blair Mills. She was graduating from an Ivy League university in exactly 2 days. Paying for that portfolio had required a level of financial gymnastics I was intimately familiar with. I had picked up 4 extra weekend shifts. I had eaten generic instant noodles for 21 straight dinners. I had walked to work in the rain to save the $2.50 on bus fare. I did all of this because I wanted to hand her something that belonged in her new world. I wanted her to have something real, something that proved her older sister. Despite working a dead-end hotel job and holding a degree from a local public college, could still offer her a piece of undeniable quality. I turned the key in the lock of my apartment. The door always stuck, requiring a hard shove with my shoulder. I stepped into the tiny room that smelled faintly of old radiator iron and cheap coffee. I placed the navy blue box carefully on my small laminate kitchen table. I was unbuttoning my worn winter coat when my cell phone vibrated against the cheap wood. The screen lit up with one word: Mom. My chest tightened with a sudden, foolish burst of hope. Maybe they wanted to coordinate the travel plans. Maybe they wanted to know what time my bus was arriving so we could grab dinner before the ceremony. I swiped to answer and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not even get the chance to say hello. Do not come. You will embarrass us. The voice of my mother, Elaine Mills, did not shake. It held no regret, no hesitation, and absolutely no warmth. It was a purely administrative command, delivered with the same tone she used to return an unsatisfactory bottle of wine at a country club dinner. I froze. My coat slipped from my shoulders and landed on the linoleum floor. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Mom, I asked, my voice cracking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. What are you talking about? The graduation is in 2 days, and you are not attending, Elaine said, her words clipping the air with brutal efficiency. Blair is going to be surrounded by important people, Tessa. She will be standing with the children of legacy donors. These are families who own summer mansions in Newport and hold trust funds older than this country. Her friends are entering elite fellowships. We have a reputation to maintain and an image to project. You do not fit that image. I stared at the peeling paint on my kitchen cabinet. My breathing turned shallow. I am her sister. You are a liability, she countered swiftly. Look at yourself. Tessa, you went to a public commuter school. You work night shifts at a mid-tier hotel. You buy your clothes off the discount racks at outlet malls. If you stand next to Blair in your cheap synthetic dress, you will look like the waitstaff. People will ask questions. People will judge. I will not have you ruining the most important day of your sister's life because you selfishly want to play the supportive sibling. The cruelty of her words was so precise, so calculated, that it felt like a physical incision. I looked over at the closet door. Hanging on the outside hook was the dress I had bought for the ceremony. It was a simple, conservative black dress. It had cost me $45 on clearance. I had spent 3 hours ironing it carefully, making sure every seam was perfectly flat, I had bought a new pair of plain black flats to match. It was the best I could do. To my mother, my very best was a stain on their perfect family portrait. "I bought a bus ticket," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "It cost me $80. I begged my manager to let me swap 3 shifts so I could have the weekend off. I bought Blair a gift. "Cancel the ticket," Elaine snapped. She did not care about my shifts or my $80. To her, $80 was the cost of a mediocre appetizer. "Throw the dress away. Mail the gift if you must. But do not show your face on that campus. We have worked too hard to build Blair up. I will not let your grim, depressing little life drag her down. I am turning my phone off now. Do not call back." The line went dead. There was no goodbye, just the hollow, electronic silence of a severed connection. I slowly lowered the phone to the table. I sat down on the rickety wooden chair. My mind was numb. I kept staring at the black screen, waiting. I was waiting for my father, Grant Mills, to call. I was waiting for the man who was supposed to protect his daughters equally to step in and fix this. Grant always played the quiet, reasonable diplomat. Surely he would call to soften the blow. Surely he would send a text message saying Mom was just stressed, that I should still come, that they loved me. I waited for 1 hour, then 2 hours, then 3. The sun rose higher, casting harsh rectangular shadows across my dusty floor. My phone remained entirely dark. Grant Mills never called. He never sent a message. He did not leave a voicemail. And in that suffocating morning silence, I realized a bitter truth. My mother's words had been a brutal, frontal assault, but my father's silence was a cowardly, lingering poison. His silence was infinitely more humiliating. It meant he agreed with her. It meant he, too, looked at me and saw nothing but a peasant intruding on a royal court. I was a stain to be hidden in the attic. I stood up. My legs felt hollow, drained of the adrenaline that had fueled my night shift. I walked over to the closet. I did not cry. Crying required a belief that something unfair had happened, a belief that I deserved better from them. But the truth had just been laid bare. This was exactly who they were. This was exactly how they viewed me. I took the cheap black dress off the hook. I folded it carefully, lining up the sleeves, and placed it back into the dark recesses of my closet. I walked over to my small desk. I opened the top drawer and took out the printed paper bus ticket. The departure time read 6:15 in the morning. I folded the ticket exactly in half, then in quarters, and dropped it into the back of the drawer. Then I walked back to the kitchen table and looked at the navy blue box. This was the final piece. This was the last remnant of a pathetic, desperate hope I had harbored since childhood. The hope that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just smart enough, if I gave them everything I had, they would eventually look at me with pride. But looking at the box now, I knew they would never see my effort. They would only see the price tag. They would only see the dirt under my fingernails from crawling to meet them. I did not smash the box. I did not throw it against the wall. Anger is a hot, messy emotion, and my family had just frozen every drop of warmth left in my veins. Instead, a cold, mechanical calm washed over me. When the post office opened the next morning at 8 o'clock, I was the first person in line. I handed the clerk the navy blue box. I had taped it shut meticulously. Inside, tucked beneath the leather, was a small, plain white card. I had written exactly 5 words on it. "Proud of you. Love, Tessa." I paid the $14 for priority shipping. I watched the clerk toss the package into a canvas bin. I walked out of the post office and back into the cold suburban air, effectively disappearing from my family's life. I changed my number later that week. I deleted every social media account I owned. I made myself a ghost. I walked away believing that was the end of the story. I believed I was simply cutting my losses and moving forward into a solitary, quiet life. I had no way of knowing what that package would become. I did not know that Blair would take that beautiful, expensive leather portfolio and toss it carelessly into a dusty storage room. I did not know that my father would use it to house fraudulent vendor contracts. I did not know that my mother would use it as a prop to charm wealthy donors into a scam. And I certainly did not know that years later, that exact same leather portfolio with the initials BM stamped in gold would land on an auditing desk directly in front of me. I did not know that the very gift I bought with my blood and sweat would become the private, devastating piece of evidence I would use to bury their golden empire alive. But that day, standing outside the post office at 27 years old, I only knew one thing. I was done being the embarrassment. From that moment on, I belonged only to myself. Growing up in our neighborhood meant adhering to a very specific set of unspoken zoning laws for human behavior. We lived in a sprawling colonial house in a wealthy, aggressively manicured suburb where the exact width of your driveway and the landscaping of your front lawn dictated your social standing. In this insulated world, my mother operated under one defining philosophy. She believed with absolute, unwavering certainty that the most crucial metric of a successful family was not the moral character of the children living inside the house, but rather how undeniably expensive the family portrait looked when printed on heavy cardstock and mailed out to 100 contacts every December. My younger sister was the ultimate, flawless centerpiece of that curated portrait. Blair was the undisputed golden child of the Mills family. She possessed an effortless, camera-ready beauty and a naturally sweet cadence to her voice that adults found utterly intoxicating. My parents did not merely raise Blair, they invested in her. They treated her entire development like a high-yield corporate project designed to guarantee maximum social return. By the time she reached her early teenage years, she was already being groomed for the upper echelons of society. While other kids were navigating the messy, unscripted awkwardness of puberty, Blair was equipped with a dedicated team of professionals. She had a private French tutor who came to our house twice a week to perfect her accent. She had an elite college admissions counselor retained at a cost of tens of thousands of dollars to meticulously curate her high school experience. Her summers were never spent idle or unsupervised. They were heavily scheduled with international summer camps and volunteer excursions that were explicitly designed to look breathtaking in an Ivy League admissions brochure. She traveled to developing nations for exactly 2 weeks, just long enough to capture the perfect, high-resolution photographs of her holding a paintbrush while looking empathetically into the camera, surrounded by local children. It was a manufactured philanthropy, polished to a high gloss to ensure her resume was untouchable. My existence in that house was a completely different, parallel reality. I lacked Blair's soft edges and her innate ability to charm wealthy neighbors at dinner parties. My mind was stubbornly analytical, wired for complex mathematics and strict logic rather than small talk and graceful social maneuvering. Because I did not fit the aesthetic requirements of my mother's grand vision, I was quietly and efficiently sidelined. I realized very early on that if I wanted anything beyond the bare minimum required by law, I had to procure it myself. I started working my first job the exact week I turned 16 years old. I traded my afternoons and my weekends for minimum wage at a local pharmacy, stocking shelves, organizing inventory, and sweeping floors until my hands were raw. I used every single dollar I earned to sustain my own academic existence. I bought my own heavy test preparation books. I paid my own registration fees for every advanced placement exam I took. I paid for the gasoline that went into the severely rusted, decade-old sedan I had bought from a neighbor using my own hoarded savings. I became a ghost in my own home, slipping in through the side door smelling of floor cleaner and exhaustion while Blair entertained her polished friends in the main living room. The starkest dividing line between us was never drawn with screaming matches, physical abuse, or dramatic, tearful confrontations. It was drawn entirely with money. I remember the exact evening the reality of my situation crystallized into something hard, cold, and permanent. It was a Tuesday in late October during my senior year of high school. I needed a specific accounting software program for an advanced independent study class. The program cost $199. It was a sum I simply did not have after draining my bank account to pay for my college application fees the week prior. I found my father in his home office, surrounded by dark mahogany furniture and leather-bound books he never read. I laid out my request logically, explaining that the software was absolutely mandatory for my final grade and my subsequent college credits. Grant Mills did not even look up from his glowing computer monitor. He delivered a brief, emotionless lecture about how true character is built through strict self-reliance. He told me that handing me the money would do me a massive disservice, that I needed to learn the harsh value of $1 and solve my own logistical problems like an adult. I accepted his rejection silently, turning on my heel and walking out of the room. Less than 3 hours later, I was sitting at the kitchen island struggling through calculus homework when Blair bounced into the room. She announced enthusiastically that her friends had just invited her on a spontaneous weekend getaway to Nantucket, and she needed emergency funds for the ferry tickets, waterfront dining, and boutique shopping. My father, the exact same man who had just preached the gospel of financial austerity over $199, pulled a heavy platinum credit card from his wallet without a single second of hesitation. He handed it to her with a fond, indulgent smile, telling her to have a wonderful time and to make sure she took plenty of beautiful pictures for her mother. I watched the exchange with a strange, detached clarity. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not scream about the staggering injustice of it all. I just looked down and went back to my numbers. That night, I learned that financial support in the Mills household was not based on need, nor was it based on merit. It was a casting budget, and I simply had not won a role in their grand production. Months later, the college acceptance letters finally arrived. I had applied to a rigorously ranked public university renowned for its exceptional accounting and data analytics program. When the thick envelope came in the mail, officially offering me a spot in their highly competitive data science track, I felt a rare surge of pure, unfiltered pride. I brought the acceptance letter to the grand dining table that evening. I placed it directly next to my mother's salad plate. Elaine glanced at the seal of the public university. Her expression instantly flattened into a mask of polite, chilling indifference. Grant gave the piece of paper a cursory nod before returning to his steak. There were no warm smiles. There was no sudden popping of expensive champagne corks. There were no proud announcements aggressively drafted for their social circles. Instead, my father took a slow sip of his iced water and delivered a single, definitive sentence that would ring in my ears for years. "Do not expect us to pay a single cent of your tuition." That was the entirety of the celebration. That was the absolute extent of their acknowledgement of my relentless hard work. I took the letter back to my small bedroom. I spent the rest of that night sitting cross-legged on my worn carpet, bathed in the harsh blue light of my cheap laptop screen. I was entirely alone, navigating the labyrinth of complex federal student aid applications. I had to track down my parents' tax returns for the forms, piecing together the undeniable reality of their immense wealth on paper while they deliberately denied me even a microscopic fraction of it in reality. I saw their deductions, their hidden assets, and the massive gross income that made their refusal to help me not a matter of necessity, but a matter of pure, targeted cruelty. I calculated exactly how many hours I would need to work each week, at the lowest wages, just to keep myself alive, housed, and enrolled. I mapped out a brutal, unforgiving survival plan built on merit scholarships, heavily subsidized loans, and relentless overnight shifts. It was precisely during those grueling, isolated years that I inadvertently sharpened the single greatest weapon I would ever possess. Stripped entirely of a safety net, I was forced to intimately understand the absolute truth of money. I began to view financial records not just as boring numbers on a page, but as a deeply revealing map of human behavior. I learned to read a corporate balance sheet the exact same way a seasoned detective reads a bloody crime scene. I learned that numbers, unlike my parents, are completely incapable of holding a bias. I realized that when people lie, their words are smooth and convincing, but their math always stutters. While sitting in cheap, fluorescent-lit diners at 2 a.m, reviewing complex corporate case studies and my own meager, desperate budgets, I developed an unnatural, predatory ability to spot discrepancies. I could glance at a dense column of figures and immediately sense the subtle, hidden rhythms of financial deception. I saw the deliberately mismatched numbers that normal people carelessly glossed over. I recognized the tiny, deliberate gaps where truth had been quietly siphoned away to secretly fund a lie. I learned to track the hidden flow of resources, understanding on a cellular level that money always leaves a visible trail, no matter how desperately or intelligently someone tries to sweep it clean. The favoritism in our family was a masterclass in psychological warfare precisely because it was so overwhelmingly silent. It never required a raised voice or a shattered glass. It operated seamlessly on a brutal, invisible set of rules. Blair was continuously showered with infinite resources because her surface appearance provided a beautiful, easily digestible narrative for their wealthy peers. She was a trophy meant to be displayed. I, on the other hand, was intentionally abandoned to the wilderness because my chosen trajectory was deemed too gritty, too working class, and too rough to ever be shown off at a Sunday country club brunch. They deliberately starved me of affection and financial support, safely assuming I would simply fade into the background and remain a quiet, inconsequential disappointment for the rest of my life. They never realized that by forcing me out into the freezing cold, they were teaching me exactly how to see perfectly in the dark. They thought they were simply saving money on a bad, unphotogenic investment. They had absolutely no idea they were actively, meticulously training the architect of their own total destruction. The morning of the commencement ceremony arrived with a suffocating, stagnant heat that trapped itself inside my small apartment. The single-window unit air conditioner I owned had broken 3 days prior, leaving the air feeling heavy and damp. I sat cross-legged on my faded area rug, balancing my battered 5-year-old laptop on my knees. Next to me on the floor sat a chipped ceramic mug filled with bitter, lukewarm instant coffee. I had spent the entirety of the past 48 hours desperately convincing myself that witnessing the event through a pixelated screen would somehow be enough. The university's official livestream loaded with a bright, high-definition sweep of the historic campus green. The sunlight there looked entirely different from the harsh glare baking my neighborhood. It looked crisp, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawns, the towering stone arches, and the thousands of folding chairs arranged with geometric precision. About 20 minutes into the broadcast, the camera slowly panned across the premium seating area reserved for major donors and distinguished alumni. My breath caught in my throat. I found them almost immediately. My parents were seated in the third row, bathed in the dappled shade of a massive oak tree. They looked flawlessly radiant. Grant wore a sharply tailored, custom charcoal suit that draped perfectly across his shoulders, paired with a silk tie that caught the light. Elaine sat beside him, the absolute picture of Northeastern high society. She wore an elegant, tailored ivory dress and a wide-brimmed sun hat, accessorized with a string of heavy, authentic pearls. They were smiling brightly, leaning in to chat with the wealthy families seated next to them. I stared at the screen, a cold realization settling into my stomach. For years, whenever I had asked for a fraction of support, for textbook money, for help with a medical bill, they had recited rehearsed speeches about cash flow problems and strict financial boundaries. Yet, sitting there in the VIP section, they radiated an aura of endless, unbothered wealth. Money had never been the issue. I was the issue. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the keys on my laptop to capture a screenshot of the broadcast. I opened the messaging application on my phone, navigated to our dormant family group chat, and attached the image. I typed a brief, neutral message. "Congratulations, Blair. You two look great." I pressed send at exactly 10 in the morning. I left the phone facing upward on the floor beside my coffee mug. I watched the rest of the 2-hour ceremony in silence, listening to the speeches about changing the world and building a brighter future. My phone screen remained entirely black. No red receipts, no polite thank you. Absolute, echoing silence. I went about my day in a numb haze, cleaning my tiny kitchen, organizing my sparse closet, doing anything to keep my hands moving. At 4 in the afternoon, my phone finally buzzed. It was not a text message. It was a notification from a social media application. Blair had just uploaded a massive, professionally edited photo album of her graduation day. I opened the application. The first image was a stunning portrait of Blair standing between our parents, all three of them beaming with overwhelming joy. She held her diploma high. Grant had his arm securely around her shoulder. Elaine was looking at her with a level of pure, unadulterated adoration I had never once experienced. I looked beneath the photograph to read the caption. It was short, decorated with a single heart, and absolutely devastating. Just us three, always, just us three. Not a family of 4-1 who could not make it, not a celebration missing an older sister. She had publicly, effortlessly rewritten the entire history of our family to exclude my existence. I was not just absent, I was erased. Before I could fully process the weight of that caption, a private text message appeared at the top of my screen. It was from Elaine. Do not tag yourself in these photos. Do not leave a comment. Do not try to insert yourself into this milestone and draw people's attention to our inappropriate contrast. Let your sister have her flawless day. I read the message 3 times. I waited for the familiar, burning sting of tears behind my eyes. I waited for the crushing wave of grief that usually followed my mother's cruelty, but nothing came. For the very first time in my 27 years of life, my eyes remained completely dry. The desperate, wounded child inside of me simply stopped breathing. In her place, something incredibly quiet and terrifyingly cold woke up. I did not reply. I opened the settings on my phone. I blocked Elaine's number. I blocked Grant's number. I blocked Blair's number. I navigated to my social media accounts and permanently deactivated every single one of them. I wiped my digital presence clean. First thing the next morning, I would walk into a carrier store and change my phone number completely. I was dead to them, which meant they were finally dead to me. That night, I walked into the Harbor Point Suites for my midnight auditing shift. The lobby was deserted, illuminated only by the soft, yellow glow of the security sconces. I settled into the back office, booted up the property management system, and pulled up the weekly catering and banquet ledgers. My mind was unusually sharp, stripped of all personal anxiety and narrowed down to a laser-focused clarity. At 2 a.m, while cross-referencing the monthly vendor payouts, my eyes snagged on a microscopic anomaly. It was a series of charges for floral arrangements and premium linen rentals for a mid-sized corporate retreat held 3 weeks prior. At first glance, the numbers looked perfectly standard. But when I pulled the corresponding invoices from the digital archive, the rhythm of the data felt off. I dug deeper, tracing the vendor identification numbers. I found 2 identical invoices, submitted 4 days apart. One was paid through the standard operational budget, the other was routed through a secondary, obscure special events account managed directly by the regional director of sales. I pulled the bank routing information for the second vendor. It did not belong to a floral company. It led to a newly registered limited liability company operating out of a residential address. The regional director was deliberately double billing corporate clients and quietly skimming the duplicated funds into a personal shell account. It was a sophisticated, quiet theft, disguised within the chaotic churn of daily hotel operations. I did not panic. I did not alert my immediate supervisor, who I knew was close friends with the director. I operated with the exact same cold detachment I had discovered in my apartment that afternoon. I meticulously downloaded the transaction histories, the duplicated invoices, the approval signatures, and the routing data. I saved everything onto an encrypted external drive. I compiled a clean chronological summary report, stripping away all assumptions and presenting only the undeniable mathematical proof. I stayed in the office 2 hours past the end of my shift. At 8 a.m, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite opened. In walked Naomi Ward. Naomi was the external financial advisor retained by the hotel's parent ownership group. She was a woman in her late 50s, legendary for her immaculate tailored suits, her absolute lack of small talk, and eyes that evaluated everything like a rapidly depreciating asset. She intimidated everyone in the building. I stood up from my desk, holding a single manila folder. I walked past the front desk, bypassed the general manager's office entirely, and knocked once on Naomi's open door. She looked up from her tablet, her expression flat. I placed the open folder directly on the center of her glass desk. I told her that the regional director of sales had stolen $42,000 over the last 6 months through duplicated banquet invoicing. I kept my voice completely steady. I informed her that the proof of the shell accounts, the fake vendor registrations, and the signed approval logs were on page 3. Naomi did not ask who I was. She did not ask why a night auditor was in her office. She simply lowered her reading glasses and looked down at the neatly organized spreadsheets. The room was totally silent for 4 agonizing minutes while she read through my summary, her eyes flicking back and forth across the columns of numbers I had mapped out. When she finally finished, she closed the folder. She did not express outrage. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a word of praise. She leaned back in her heavy leather chair, folded her hands together, and looked directly into my eyes. Her gaze was piercing, analytical, and entirely devoid of pity. "Who taught you to trace clean money like this?" she asked. It was not a compliment. It was an interrogation of my value. And in that precise moment, standing in the cold air conditioning of the executive office, I realized my entire life was about to violently change course. I did not seek out therapy to heal the wounds my family inflicted. I did not sit in a circle and talk about my feelings. I found my healing in the cold, unyielding architecture of forensic accounting. Naomi Ward did not offer me maternal warmth or a shoulder to cry on. She offered me a brutal, uncompromising apprenticeship. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, after my night shift at the hotel ended at 7 o'clock, I sat in her secondary office. She handed me stacks of redacted corporate bankruptcy filings, deliberately corrupted digital ledgers, and complex tax returns. She taught me how to hunt. She taught me that fraud is never a sudden explosion. It is a slow, deliberate leak. I learned how to resurrect deleted server logs from the deepest corners of a hard drive. I learned how to peel back the heavy layers of limited liability companies registered in offshore tax havens just to find the actual human being signing the fraudulent checks. For 18 months, I existed on perhaps 4 hours of sleep a night. I was a full-time university student during the day, a hotel auditor by night, and Naomi's personal foot soldier in the early mornings. My eyes were perpetually bloodshot, and I lived on bitter black coffee and stale protein bars. But for the very first time in my existence, an adult looked at me and saw a highly valuable asset instead of a burdensome liability. Naomi pushed me to the absolute brink of my mental endurance because she knew I had the capacity to survive it. During my senior year of college, Naomi tossed a thin, unremarkable gray folder onto my desk. It was a pro bono advisory case for a local chain of 3 seafood restaurants. The owner claimed sudden bankruptcy, citing massive supply chain costs, and had completely frozen the payroll accounts. Over 50 line cooks, dishwashers, and waitstaff were owed nearly $90,000 in back wages. The owner drove a brand new imported sports car to the bankruptcy hearings and wore custom Italian suits. The official accountants said the money was simply gone, swallowed by operational debt. Naomi told me to prove them wrong. It took me exactly 72 hours. I ignored the standard profit and loss statements that the owner's accountants had neatly prepared. I went directly into the raw, unfiltered vendor transaction data. I found a recurring weekly expense categorized under heavy kitchen equipment maintenance. The vendor receiving the payments was a company incorporated only 3 months prior. I cross-referenced the registration address of the vendor with public property records. It was a residential property owned by the restaurant owner's brother. They were bleeding the restaurant dry, funneling the operational cash into a fake consulting firm to protect their personal wealth while the people who scrubbed their floors faced sudden eviction. When Naomi presented my precise findings to the State Labor Board, the owner settled within 48 hours to avoid criminal fraud charges. The restaurant workers received every single cent of their $90,000. I stood in the back of the legal office watching the dishwashers receive their checks. I felt a tectonic shift inside my chest. I realized then that financial truth possesses a destructive, undeniable power that completely eclipses any screaming match or emotional family argument. You cannot gaslight a bank routing number. You cannot manipulate a server log with a charming smile or an expensive dress. Numbers are immune to high society politics. The week after I graduated from the university with the highest honors in my class, Naomi made a single phone call. The following Monday, I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled downtown offices of North Harbor Forensic Partners. I was hired at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder as a junior data analyst. The firm was a high-stakes, ruthless environment where partners routinely dismantled massive corporate frauds and investigated white-collar crimes. I thrived in the immense pressure. While other analysts relied heavily on automated software programs to flag financial anomalies, I simply memorized the data. I possessed an unsettling photographic retention for mismatched dates, duplicate invoice numbers, and irregular transfer amounts. Within 2 years, I carved out a very specific, intimidating reputation. I actively volunteered for the messy, convoluted files that the senior investigators avoided. I took on cases involving third-generation family businesses, where the patriarch was quietly draining the trust funds to pay off gambling debts. I dismantled retail chains that were aggressively hiding massive debt behind thick walls of shell companies. I audited prominent charitable foundations where the board of directors treated the donation pool like a personal slush fund for private jets and luxury vacations. I sat across polished mahogany conference tables from men and women who possessed generational wealth and immense social power. When they raised their voices, threatened to ruin my career, or attempted to intimidate me with their high-priced legal teams, my pulse never elevated. I simply slid the highlighted bank records across the table, tapped my pen on the fraudulent signature, and waited in total silence. They quickly learned that my quiet demeanor was not a sign of weakness. It was an impending execution. I did not argue with liars. I simply handed them the undeniable proof of their lies. During those grueling years of building my career, the past would occasionally attempt to intrude. A distant aunt or a disconnected cousin who did not understand the absolute finality of my estrangement would send me a text message. My phone would light up with a forwarded photograph. It would usually be a picture of Blair attending a highly exclusive charity gala, wearing a silk gown that cost more than my first car. The messages would include cheerful, completely oblivious updates about the elite circles she was moving in, the wealthy heirs she was dating, and the flawless image my parents were successfully projecting to the world. They wanted me to know that the golden child was still shining brightly. I never replied to a single message. I never felt a sudden urge to defend myself or explain why I was no longer standing in the family portrait. I would look at the glossy and heavily filtered image of my sister holding a glass of imported champagne, and I would feel absolutely nothing. The anger had burned itself out long ago. Then, I would press delete. I permanently blocked the sender's number. I no longer harbored any desperate, lingering desire for their love or their validation. Love was a fragile, highly conditional currency in the Mills family, and I had permanently opted out of that toxic economy. My only ambition was to construct a life built entirely of solid steel. I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress of professional competence, total financial independence, and undeniable leverage. I wanted to anchor myself so deeply into the absolute bedrock of reality that absolutely no one, especially not the people who shared my last name, could ever drag me below the surface again. I was building a life where I was the one holding the ledger. By the time I reached 29 years old, the senior partners at North Harbor called me into the glass corner office overlooking the city skyline. They officially promoted me to the position of lead forensic investigator. It was an unprecedented career trajectory for someone my age. My life was certainly not glamorous. I did not attend country club dinners or spend my summers in coastal mansions. My entire wardrobe consisted of sharply tailored, neutral-colored suits. My apartment was quiet, heavily secured, and immaculately clean. But I had achieved something far more potent than cheap social prestige. I had acquired real, terrifying power based purely on my own merit. I was not a socialite dancing for the approval of wealthy donors. I was the financial Grim Reaper. And in the wealthy, insulated circles of the city, people who harbored dark secrets and dirty money began to genuinely fear seeing the name Tessa Mills printed on the cover of their official audit notification letters. The transition from an elite university campus to the harsh realities of the professional world can be jarring for those who have never actually worked a single day in their lives. After graduation, Blair quickly realized that corporate America demanded tangible deliverables, strict accountability, and long hours that severely interfered with her social calendar. She had no interest in starting at the bottom of a legitimate corporate hierarchy. Instead, she utilized our parents' extensive country club connections to gracefully parachute into the highly lucrative, profoundly superficial world of high society nonprofit organizations. In certain affluent circles, the charity sector is not a place for grueling social work or grassroots organizing. It is an elaborate, tax-deductible playground for the wealthy. It is an industry where a curated aesthetic and a smooth, persuasive vocabulary are vastly more valuable than actual administrative competence. Blair was tailor-made for this specific ecosystem. She was seamlessly installed into a prominent role at the Legacy Bridge Initiative. The Legacy Bridge Initiative was a newly minted, aggressively publicized scholarship fund. Its publicly stated mission was incredibly noble. It promised to identify brilliant, low-income female students from underprivileged public high schools and provide them with the financial backing and elite mentorship necessary to access top-tier universities. It was a beautiful narrative, designed specifically to pull forcefully at the heartstrings and the heavy wallets of wealthy suburban donors. Outwardly, my sister was the absolute perfect face for the organization. She possessed the exact right blend of inherited elegance and rehearsed empathy. Her professional life became an endless sequence of highly photogenic moments. She wore beautifully tailored designer dresses to afternoon fundraising luncheons. She delivered perfectly pitched, emotionally manipulative speeches about bridging the educational divide. She posed for countless photographs with the handful of minority students the fund had selected as their inaugural class. Her social media feeds became a relentless stream of carefully curated images, accompanied by lengthy captions heavily saturated with modern philanthropic buzzwords like purpose, sustainable impact, and systemic change. However, beneath the glossy surface of her perfectly lit photographs, the operational reality of the charity was a spectacular disaster. Blair held a senior director title, yet she fundamentally did not understand how a basic operational budget functioned. She had absolutely no concept of fiduciary duty, compliance regulations, or ethical fund disbursement. To her, the entire organization was simply a magnificent, taxpayer-subsidized extension of her own personal brand. She viewed the charity's operating account not as a sacred trust meant for impoverished students, but as a boundless styling budget necessary to maintain her image as a leading humanitarian. She transformed vital fundraising galas into lavish personal runways, prioritizing the cost of imported floral centerpieces and premium open bars over the actual scholarship endowments. My mother, Elaine, became absolutely intoxicated by this new, elevated version of her golden child. She paraded Blair's title around their wealthy neighborhood like a crown jewel. At every dinner party and charity auction, Elaine loudly broadcasted to anyone who would listen that her daughter was single-handedly transforming the landscape of American education. She aggressively marketed Blair as a selfless visionary, conveniently omitting the fact that her visionary daughter could not read a simple balance sheet. Predictably, the math began to violently collapse. Throwing a gala that costs $150,000 in order to raise only $200,000 is a mathematical death spiral. The Legacy Bridge Initiative was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, spending vastly more capital on its own luxurious image than on the actual girls it had promised to help. As the operational accounts began to run dangerously low, the beautiful facade of the Mills family was suddenly threatened with public humiliation. This is exactly where my father, Grant, stepped in to quietly patch the sinking ship. Grant had spent his entire life managing the optics of our family, and he was not about to let his daughter fail in front of the people he played golf with every Sunday. But instead of forcing Blair to cut her exorbitant event budgets or restructure the charity's management, Grant and Elaine chose a much darker, infinitely more destructive path. They needed a way to secretly funnel money back into their own pockets to sustain the lifestyle they were demanding the charity pay for. Together, my parents registered a limited liability company called Elm Row Consulting. It was a classic, textbook shell company. It had no actual office, no legitimate employees, and provided absolutely no real services. Elm Row Consulting existed for one singular purpose. It was designed to issue massive, heavily inflated invoices to the Legacy Bridge Initiative for completely fabricated services, vaguely labeled on the ledgers as strategic event coordination and donor relations consulting. Whenever Blair hosted a lavish fundraising dinner, Grant would quietly slip an invoice from Elm Row Consulting into the charity's accounts payable file. The charity, desperate for the optics of success and functionally managed by a completely incompetent director, would blindly pay the invoices. The money would flow out of the scholarship fund, meant for the tuition of struggling high school girls, and wash directly into my parents' private bank accounts. They were actively embezzling from a children's charity to subsidize their own daughter's socialite lifestyle and protect their neighborhood status. To complete this masterpiece of suburban hypocrisy, Blair required the appropriate accessories to look the part of a serious executive during her high-stakes meetings with wealthy benefactors. She needed something that conveyed quiet luxury and professional competence. She rummaged through a forgotten storage closet in our parents' home and found a premium, full-grain leather portfolio. It was navy blue, with the initials BM stamped into the cover in elegant gold. It was the exact same portfolio I had bought her for graduation. It was the gift I had starved myself for weeks to afford. The gift I had mailed on the exact same morning my mother had banished me from their lives. Blair had no idea of the sacrifice attached to it. She simply saw an expensive prop that matched her designer shoes. She carried that portfolio into every board meeting, using it to hold the falsified donor cards and the inflated event budgets. She clutched my desperate offering of sisterly love to her chest while she actively defrauded the public. She had absolutely no idea that the very object she was using to legitimize her beautiful lie was going to become the exact weapon I would eventually use to hang them all. For nearly 3 years, the grift operated flawlessly. The wealthy donors were entirely mesmerized by Blair's superficial charm and the emotional photographs of the scholarship students. Local lifestyle magazines published glowing feature articles about the organization, praising the Mills family as a brilliant, refreshing wind of change in the philanthropic sector. My parents had successfully constructed yet another magnificent castle built entirely out of beautiful photographs, the scent of expensive perfume, and fraudulent data that absolutely no one had bothered to verify. But illusions funded by stolen money always have an expiration date. The fatal crack in their perfect architecture did not come from an internal whistleblower or a sudden attack of moral conscience. It came from the cold, unavoidable reality of the academic calendar. A highly prominent, deeply influential donor had pledged a massive sum of money specifically earmarked for the first semester tuition of 25 high school seniors. As late August approached, the universities began issuing aggressive warnings for unpaid tuition balances. The desperate students, who had believed their entire futures were securely funded, started calling the charity's office in a panic. The major donor received a tearful phone call from a student whose enrollment was about to be officially canceled due to non-payment. The donor demanded an immediate meeting with the board of directors. She bypassed Blair's smooth-talking deflection tactics and demanded to see the raw, unedited financial disbursement logs. She wanted to know exactly where the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had donated over the past 2 years had actually gone. When the internal accountants frantically tried to reconcile the books to appease her, they found massive, unexplainable black holes in the ledger. They found the heavy recurring payments to Elm Row Consulting. The beautiful, expensive curtain was about to be violently ripped down. And my family, completely blinded by their own arrogance and their absolute belief in their untouchable status, had absolutely no idea that the independent forensic auditing firm hired to investigate their shattered charity was about to assign their most ruthless investigator to the case. A coalition of major financial backers and civil litigation attorneys representing the defrauded scholarship students officially filed an injunction. They demanded an immediate, exhaustive, independent audit of the Legacy Bridge Initiative. The court granted the request, and the mandate fell directly onto the polished desks of North Harbor Forensic Partners. When the file first landed in my queue on a rainy Tuesday morning, I barely registered the name of the charity. To a senior forensic investigator, charitable fraud is tragically mundane. I assumed I was simply walking into another routine dissection of bloated administrative costs and misplaced endowments. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, cracked my knuckles, and opened the initial digital discovery packet. For the first 3 hours, my eyes scanned thousands of lines of raw expense data. I was looking for the standard red flags, like offshore wire transfers or sudden spikes in executive travel budgets. Instead, I found a rhythmic, highly sophisticated bleeding of assets. The money was not being stolen in massive, noticeable chunks. It was being siphoned out through a meticulously coordinated series of vendor payments. I pulled up the primary vendor manifest. I began cross-referencing the payee names against the dates of the major fundraising galas. That is when my fingers froze over the keyboard. There, buried halfway down a spreadsheet of event caterers and audiovisual rental companies, was a familiar string of letters, Mills. Blair Mills was listed as the senior director approving the disbursements. I stared at the bright white screen of my monitor, my heart performing a sudden, violent recalibration against my ribs. I scrolled further down. The vendor receiving the largest, most frequent payments was listed as Elm Row Consulting. I pulled the corresponding invoices. They were perfectly round numbers: $25,000 for strategic gala coordination, $50,000 for high net worth donor acquisition. These payments were invariably authorized less than 48 hours after every single major charity dinner. The funds did not stay in the Elm Row operating account. The digital trail showed the money fracturing immediately, cascading down through a labyrinth of 4 different intermediary bank accounts. The sheer audacity of the structure was staggering, but it was not what made the blood drain entirely from my face. I needed to see who exactly owned Elm Row Consulting. I bypassed the standard banking ledgers and initiated a deep dive extraction of the original state incorporation documents. The registration forms loaded line by line. The primary owners were hidden behind a registered agent service, a common tactic for corporate anonymity. But amateurs always leave a digital fingerprint when they are forced to provide secondary contact information. I scrolled to the bottom of the 4th page, looking for the mandatory administrative backup contact. Printed right there in stark, black font was an email address I had not thought about in nearly a decade. It was a highly specific, alphanumeric combination I had created during my freshman year of college to apply for local accounting internships. It was an inbox I had abandoned long before I ever cut ties with my family. Only the people living under that specific roof would have possessed that exact data point. The realization hit me with the physical force of a heavy blow to the chest. They had not just abandoned me. They had not just erased my presence from their public narrative. They had reached into the discarded remnants of my past, stolen a piece of my identity, and quietly weaponized it to legitimize a dirty legal entity. They had anchored their massive financial crime to my name without a single shred of hesitation. The professional protocol in a forensic auditing firm is absolute. I stood up from my desk, locked my workstation, and walked straight down the glass corridor to the managing partner's office. Judith Vale was a terrifyingly brilliant woman who tolerated zero ethical ambiguity. I sat across from her and laid the reality of the situation bare. I disclosed my biological connection to the senior director of the charity. I disclosed the estranged nature of our relationship. I explicitly pointed out the fraudulent use of my defunct collegiate email address on the shell company's incorporation documents. I officially requested to be immediately removed from the investigation due to a massive, undeniable conflict of interest. Judith leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. She brought in the head of our internal ethics and compliance division. They reviewed my disclosure, audited my initial digital footprints on the file, and held a closed-door meeting for 2 hours. When Judith called me back into her office, her decision was highly unorthodox, but ruthlessly pragmatic. She formally denied my request to step down. The ethics board had concluded that because the perpetrators had actively utilized my stolen data to mask their tracks, I was technically a victim of identity fraud within the strict scope of the investigation. More importantly, Judith knew my specific capabilities. The perpetrators had deployed a highly aggressive digital erasure system, systematically scrubbing the cloud servers of all original invoice metadata. I was the only forensic expert in the firm capable of fully resurrecting the corrupted server logs. Judith placed me under strict daily supervisory review, but she kept my hands firmly on the wheel. She told me to trace every single cent. I returned to my desk, wrapped myself in a cold professional detachment, and began to tear the Elm Row consulting network apart piece by piece. The deeper I dug into the hidden ledgers, the more the architecture of the fraud began to feel sickeningly familiar. It was not just a crime. It was a perfect, numerical translation of my family's entire psychological blueprint. I watched the pattern emerge in the columns of recovered data. When the charity lacked actual programmatic substance, they aggressively overcompensated by spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the visual aesthetics of their events. When my parents lacked the genuine liquid capital to sustain their wealthy suburban masquerade, they compensated by illegally borrowing from a fund meant for impoverished teenagers. When they lacked basic human integrity, they compensated with beautifully constructed, heavily publicized lies. The temptation to let a quiet, destructive rage bleed into my work was immense. I possessed the power to leak the preliminary findings to the aggressive local reporters who were already circling the charity. I could have easily orchestrated a chaotic, highly public media execution before the final audit was even published, but I brutally suppressed that urge. I refused to allow this investigation to mutate into a petty, emotional vendetta. The data had to be absolutely pristine. Every single accusation had to be backed by triple-verified banking logs, irrefutable server timestamps, and legally binding digital signatures. I knew my family better than anyone. They were master manipulators. If I made one single procedural error, if I allowed one tiny fraction of personal bias to contaminate the final report, they would instantly twist the narrative. They would cast themselves as the tragic victims of a jealous, vindictive, estranged daughter. I could not give them even a millimeter of breathing room. By the time the sun began to rise over the city on the 5th consecutive day of the investigation, the final, undeniable picture of the fraud was fully rendered on my multiple screens. I sat back in the quiet hum of the deserted office building and looked at the devastation they had caused. This was no longer just a high-stakes corporate gig. It was the financial manifestation of my entire childhood, played out on a massive, criminal scale. They had simply scaled up their domestic strategy. They used Blair, the beautiful, perfectly compliant golden child, to stand in the spotlight and absorb all the admiration, the trust, and the funding. And they used me, the discarded, unphotogenic daughter, as the invisible, forgotten foundation to quietly absorb the dirt and anchor their lies. They thought I was still just the silent background noise of their lives. They had absolutely no idea that the background was about to stand up, walk into the blinding light, and demand a full accounting. The task of exhuming a murdered ledger requires patience and a complete lack of nausea. I spent the next 72 hours completely locked inside the firm's secure digital forensics lab. I began by bypassing the charity's main servers and directly targeting their encrypted cloud backups. I successfully resurrected the deleted QuickBooks files, restored the master administrator login logs, unraveled the heavily obscured budget approval chains, and pulled the raw transaction data for every single corporate credit card assigned to the executive board. When I finally overlaid all these disparate data sets onto a single timeline, the sheer scale of the depravity stripped away the last remaining layers of the organization's polished facade. The Legacy Bridge initiative was not merely suffering from weak internal oversight or misguided administrative priorities, it was a completely fabricated reality. They had not just mismanaged the scholarship funds, they had outright invented the people receiving them. As I cross-referenced the official disbursement reports against the actual tuition payments made to universities, I discovered that over 40 scholarship recipients simply did not exist. Blair had directed her staff to use random photographs of teenagers taken at community outreach events, aggressively editing the lighting and background to make them look like professional impact reports. They attached fake names and tragic backstories to these faces, printing them on glossy cardstock to hand to weeping donors after a few glasses of expensive wine. The money meant to alter the trajectories of impoverished young women had instead been diverted into a grotesque pipeline of suburban vanity. I traced the diverted funds flowing seamlessly from the charity's primary accounts directly to high-end cosmetic studios, personal wardrobe stylists, and luxury vehicle rental agencies. I found wire transfers covering a massive deposit for a sprawling penthouse apartment. Most disgustingly, I uncovered a series of heavy short-term bridge loans. Grant had been quietly funneling the stolen charity money to pay off staggering personal credit card debts, desperately trying to keep his and Elaine's financial heads above water so they would not lose face among their wealthy neighbors. They were completely bankrupt, living entirely off the stolen futures of non-existent children. The division of labor within their criminal enterprise was starkly efficient. Grant was the architect of the false paperwork. His digital signature was stamped across dozens of fabricated invoices routed through Elm Row Consulting, authorizing the release of hundreds of thousands of dollars for phantom services. Elaine was the psychological enforcer and the public relations weapon. She was responsible for hosting the lavish afternoon brunches, charming the wealthy benefactors with heavily rehearsed gossip, and ruthlessly bullying the charity's lower-level employees. I read through months of her internal communications, watching her constantly demand that the staff keep every single aspect of the operation flawlessly photogenic. It was during this deep dive into the internal communications that I unearthed a specific email thread that caused the temperature in the room to plummet. It was an exchange between Elaine and a junior graphic designer regarding the annual donor impact brochure. The designer had submitted a draft featuring photographs of 3 genuine, low-income applicants who had actually made it to the final interview stage. Elaine had replied at 2 a.m. Her directive was brutally clear. She ordered the designer to remove the 3 girls from the marketing materials immediately. Her reasoning was typed out in cold, black letters. She stated that their families did not look polished enough for the donor presentation, and that their worn clothing would ruin the aspirational aesthetic of the campaign. I sat perfectly still, staring at those words glowing on the monitor. It was a chilling, perfectly preserved echo of the exact same sentence she had used to banish me from the graduation ceremony 5 years prior. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that her cruelty toward me was not a unique failure of maternal love. It was her entire operating system. People who did not look expensive were simply discarded, whether they were her own flesh and blood or desperate high school students pleading for a chance at a better life. The digital evidence was overwhelming, but forensic audits require physical verification whenever possible. 2 days later, I drove to a secure, climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of the city, where the court-appointed receivers had seized and sealed all of the charity's physical filing cabinets. I spent the afternoon systematically opening heavy cardboard boxes, cataloging the paper trails that matched my digital reconstruction. In the corner of the 4th unit, buried beneath a stack of old promotional banners, I found a familiar object. It was a premium, full-grain leather portfolio, dyed a deep navy blue. Stamped into the bottom right corner were the initials BM in elegant gold lettering. It was the exact gift I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. It was the olive branch I had sent into the void. I put on a pair of latex evidence gloves and slowly unzipped the portfolio. The inside was stuffed with the chaotic remnants of Blair's daily fraud. There were stacks of blank, unsigned donor pledge cards. There were handwritten notes detailing seating arrangements designed to manipulate the wealthiest guests. There were rough drafts of the Elm Row invoices, with Grant's handwriting scribbled in the margins adjusting the dollar amounts upward. And tucked deep inside the back leather pocket, completely undisturbed, was a small white envelope. I pulled it out. The seal was still perfectly intact. It had never been opened. I knew exactly what was inside. 5 words written on a blank card. "Proud of you. Love, Tessa." Holding that unopened envelope in the sterile, fluorescent light of the evidence room, I experienced a profoundly strange sensation. It was incredibly painful, an absolute confirmation that my sister had never cared enough to even glance at my final offering, but simultaneously, it was incredibly clean. It scrubbed away any lingering microscopic trace of guilt I might have harbored about destroying them. I understood with total, absolute clarity that I had made the right decision when I walked away. My sincerity, my hard work, and my love had never possessed any value in that house. They only valued the leather the sentiment was wrapped in. I placed the envelope into a plastic evidence bag, sealed it, and logged it into the official chain of custody. I presented my preliminary findings to the firm's partners and the lead litigation attorneys representing the defrauded families. The reaction was swift and devastating. The sheer brazenness of the theft, combined with the exploitation of marginalized teenagers, meant this could not be handled behind closed doors. The University Board of Trustees, furious that their prestigious name had been used to legitimize the scam, aligned with the major donors. They jointly filed an emergency petition to hold a massive, public accountability hearing directly on the Ivy League campus. The agenda was set to formally present the preliminary audit results, execute an immediate vote to freeze all personal and organizational assets, and publicly terminate the entire executive board of the Legacy Bridge Initiative. Summons were issued. My parents and Blair were legally required to attend. Through the legal grapevine, I learned exactly how the Mills family was preparing for the confrontation. They were treating it like a temporary public relations crisis. They genuinely believed they were walking into a standard, polite board meeting. They were convinced that because they lived in the right neighborhood and wore the right clothes, the normal rules of consequence did not apply to them. They assumed Blair would shed a few photogenic tears. Elaine would deliver a masterful performance of shocked innocence. Grant would offer a polite promise to restructure the accounting practices, and the entire unpleasant affair would be quietly swept into a confidential settlement. They were preparing for a polite negotiation. They had absolutely no idea they were walking into their own public execution. Exactly 5 years after that humiliating morning in my sweltering studio apartment, I walked back onto the sprawling campus of the Ivy League University in Philadelphia. The university architecture was deliberately designed to intimidate. It was a fortress of massive stone columns, towering iron gates, and centuries of accumulated wealth radiating from the manicured lawns. 5 years ago, I had viewed this exact place through a cracked laptop screen, drinking bitter instant coffee while my mother ordered me to stay away, so I would not stain their image. Today, the campus security guards held the heavy wrought iron gates open for me. I did not arrive on a discounted bus. I did not sneak through the side entrances carrying a clearance rack dress in a plastic garment bag. I walked straight up the main limestone pathways, wearing a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit. I was no longer an uninvited guest, hoping to catch a fleeting glimpse of a family that despised me. I was the lead independent financial investigator, and I carried the complete destruction of their legacy inside a highly encrypted drive in my briefcase. An hour before the emergency public hearing was scheduled to begin, Judith Vale pulled me into a private briefing room adjacent to the main auditorium. The heavy oak doors muffled the growing, angry hum of the gathering crowd outside. Dozens of wealthy donors who had been swindled out of hundreds of thousands of dollars were taking their seats. Judith placed a hand on my arm, looking at me with a rare expression of genuine concern. She offered me a professional courtesy that was almost never extended in our firm. She asked if I wanted to petition the Board of Trustees to move my presentation into a closed executive session. She knew my maiden name. She knew exactly who was sitting in the front row. She wanted to spare me the psychological violence of publicly executing my own blood relatives. I looked at Judith and declined her offer without a single second of hesitation. I explained that my family had built their fraudulent empire by manipulating public perception and stealing community funds. They had robbed marginalized teenagers of their futures while smiling brightly for local newspaper photographers. The money belonged to the public, and the theft was aggressively public. Therefore, the reckoning absolutely had to be public. I would not allow them the luxury of hiding their crimes behind closed doors and confidential settlement agreements. Naomi Ward had cleared her entire schedule and flown across the country specifically for this hearing. She stood in the corner of the briefing room, observing the wealthy benefactors filing into the building through the window. She did not offer me emotional comfort or warm words of encouragement. She acted exactly as she had during my brutal early morning training sessions years ago. She walked over, adjusted the lapel of my jacket, and delivered her final instructions. She told me to lock my jaw and keep my vocal tone completely flat. She reminded me that anger implies a loss of control, and I was the one holding all the power in the room. She ordered me to strip every ounce of personal history out of my voice, keep the data perfectly clean, and let the mathematics execute the final blow. I walked over to the staging table and reviewed the official seating manifesto for the auditorium. The university administration had arranged the room to accommodate the massive influx of angry benefactors, legal representatives, and local press. I dragged my pen across the heavy parchment paper until I found their names. The Mills family had been granted priority placement. They were seated in the exact dead center of the absolute front row, right next to the university provost and the highest contributing board members. They were placed in the premium donor relations section because Blair technically still held the title of senior event coordinator until the final board vote was cast. As the lead investigator, I possessed the unilateral authority to request a seating rearrangement. I could have easily instructed the security detail to banish them to the overflow seating in the balcony. I could have had them barred from the building entirely, but I chose to leave the seating chart exactly as it was printed. For my entire life, they had aggressively fought to secure the front row. They believed they inherently deserved the best seats in every single room they entered. I decided to let them have their coveted position. I wanted them to have an unobstructed, perfect view of their own annihilation. I wanted them to sit there, surrounded by the wealthy peers they worshipped, and listen to the absolute truth about themselves. While I was reviewing the microphone frequencies with the audio technician, a frantic administrative coordinator from the charity rushed into the backstage area. She was sweating heavily and clutching a stack of disorganized program agendas. She did not know my identity. She only recognized me as the auditor running the meeting. She let out a breathless complaint about how difficult her morning had been. She mentioned that Blair had been in a state of absolute hysteria for the past 5 days. According to the coordinator, Blair had misplaced a highly expensive navy blue leather portfolio that contained all the crucial blank donor pledge cards and the seating notes. Blair had ordered the staff to tear the entire office apart, terrified of looking unprepared and unprofessional in front of the major financial backers without her signature accessory. I stood 3 feet away, adjusting my cuffs. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I simply gave the exhausted coordinator a polite nod of acknowledgement. I kept my face perfectly blank, locking away the knowledge that the portfolio was not lost. It was currently sitting in a sealed, tamper-proof plastic evidence bag on my presentation cart, waiting to be projected onto the massive screen. I walked to the central podium to synchronize my files with the master projector. I opened the main directory and ran through the slides one final time, the screen illuminated with the undeniable architecture of their crimes. There were the massive cash flow diagrams showing the scholarship funds draining into my father's shell company. There were the recorded Internet Protocol addresses, proving that the fraudulent vendor invoices were generated from the router inside their suburban home. There were the side-by-side photographs showing how Blair had manipulated stock images to invent fake scholarship recipients. I had mapped out a massive, undeniable timeline documenting exactly how their superficial lies had steadily escalated into grand larceny. I was completely confident in the data. The numbers were bulletproof, and the evidence was legally binding. The only thing I had spent the last 24 hours practicing was my physical reaction. I had stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room, rehearsing how to look directly into the faces of the people who had actively convinced me I was a worthless embarrassment, without allowing my hands to shake. I practiced breathing through the lingering shadows of my childhood trauma. I forced myself to accept that the people sitting in the front row were no longer my parents and my sister. They were simply subjects of an active financial investigation. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 2 in the afternoon. The massive brass bells of the university clock tower began to toll, signaling the official start of the emergency session. I heard the low, anxious murmur of 300 people settling into their seats on the other side of the wall. Judith Vale gave me a sharp nod from the doorway. I picked up my single, thin manila folder containing the executive summary of the investigation. I stood completely still outside the heavy oak doors of the grand auditorium. I placed my palm against the cool metal of the door handle. A profound, unbreakable quiet settled over my mind. For decades, I had been the desperate child standing outside the dining room, practically begging for permission to sit at their table. I had starved myself for their scraps of approval and cried over my own perceived inadequacy. But as I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the blinding light of the auditorium, I finally understood the truth. I was no longer the girl asking for a seat. I was the one holding the pen, and I was about to write the final verdict. The grand auditorium of the university hummed with a heavy, suffocating tension. The expansive room was packed to its absolute maximum capacity. Seated in the elevated wooden pews were the distinguished members of the University Board of Trustees, their faces cast in grim, unforgiving lines. Flanking them were the major financial backers, the incredibly wealthy donors who had written massive checks believing they were funding the future. Scattered throughout the middle rows were several local investigative reporters, their digital recorders already glowing red on their laps. But the most devastating presence in the room sat near the rear aisles. They were the parents of the actual scholarship applicants, ordinary, hard-working people who had been fed a diet of beautiful, empty promises. I stood entirely concealed in the shadows of the backstage wing, watching the front row. The Mills family had arrived exactly 15 minutes early to ensure they could properly greet the most influential people in the room. Blair was currently projecting a sickeningly perfect aura of fake confidence. She sat tall, her posture immaculate, chatting lightly with a major benefactor seated to her left. Elaine was draped in a flawlessly tailored cream-colored suit, her posture screaming generational wealth and untouchable status. Beside her, Grant repeatedly checked a heavy, gleaming silver watch on his wrist, aggressively projecting the image of an incredibly busy, important executive whose valuable time was merely being wasted by a minor clerical misunderstanding. They genuinely believed that their expensive clothes and their polished smiles provided an impenetrable shield against a forensic ledger. The heavy wooden gavel struck the primary sounding block. The room instantly fell into a dead, ringing silence. The chairperson of the Board of Trustees leaned into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now call this emergency session to order. We will begin with the preliminary findings of the independent financial audit. I will now hand the floor over to the lead forensic presenter from North Harbor." I took a deep, silent breath, stepped out from the heavy velvet curtains, and walked up the short wooden staircase to the central podium. The harsh, bright spotlights hit my face. I placed my single manila folder on the wooden surface and looked directly down at the center of the front row. The reaction was instantaneous and physically violent. Grant froze completely, his hand hovering awkwardly above his leather briefcase. Elaine visibly stopped breathing, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. Blair lost her rehearsed smile in a fraction of a second. Her mouth fell open, and all the artificial color completely drained from her face. For one single, echoing heartbeat, all three of them were paralyzed by the impossible ghost standing right in front of them. The unphotogenic failure they had banished had returned as their executioner. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not introduce myself. I did not inject a single drop of personal emotion into my voice. I leaned forward and let the undeniable mathematics tear through the silence. $2,800,000, I stated, my voice echoing loudly across the vaulted stone ceilings. That is the exact amount of charitable funds that have been deliberately and systematically misappropriated from this organization over the last 36 months. Furthermore, we have confirmed that 41 individual scholarship profiles, promised to specific high school seniors, were completely fabricated and subsequently left entirely unfunded. The operational capital was instead diverted through a network of 3 unregistered shell companies via 17 distinct, heavy payments for services that were never actually rendered. I pressed the remote in my hand. The massive projection screen spanning the wall directly behind me flared to life. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the stark, undeniable cash flow diagram materialized. It displayed a thick, bright red line connecting the charity's primary operating account directly to a box labeled Elm Row Consulting. From there, the visual diagram splintered into a dozen undeniable arteries of fraud. The screen displayed the exact routing numbers funneling the stolen tuition money directly into a high-end residential penthouse deposit. Massive monthly payments to luxury vehicle leasing agencies, aggressive payoffs for heavily delinquent personal credit cards, and exorbitant invoices from private wardrobe stylists and elite country club social accounts. The illusion of a minor clerical error shattered instantly. Grant shot up from his chair. His face flushed a dark, furious crimson. He pointed a trembling finger toward the board of trustees, loudly demanding an immediate administrative recess and threatening severe legal action. Elaine desperately grabbed her microphone, cutting off her husband. Her voice shook, but she forced a tone of arrogant condescension, loudly insisting to the room that this was nothing more than a gross accounting error committed by incompetent junior staff members. Beside her, Blair attempted a sickening, crooked smile, frantically looking back at the major donors and shaking her head as if this were all just one massive, embarrassing misunderstanding. I did not yield the floor. I did not raise my voice to compete with their panic. I simply pressed the remote a second time. The screen shifted away from the diagram and displayed a dense, highly magnified spreadsheet of server login logs. I directed the attention of the room to the highlighted rows. I explained exactly what they were looking at. I showed them Blair's official administrative email address, accompanied by digital timestamps proving she had personally approved massive wire transfers at 3 a.m, immediately following her most lavish, heavily photographed galas. Then, I pulled up the secondary log. I highlighted the exact Internet Protocol address used to manually alter and falsify the vendor registration profiles every single weekend. I looked directly at Grant and stated, for the official public record, that the geographic location of that specific Internet connection matched his suburban residential address with absolute, irrefutable precision. The room began to turn toxic. The murmurs of the crowd escalated into loud, angry accusations. Donors were demanding answers. The university provost was furiously whispering to his legal counsel. I reached beneath the wooden lip of the podium. I pulled out the sealed, transparent plastic evidence bag. I broke the seal and extracted the heavy navy blue leather portfolio. I held it up so the bright stage lights caught the gold initials stamped into the bottom corner. Then, I placed it flat on the podium and opened it under the overhead document camera. The massive screen behind me now broadcasted the physical remnants of their arrogance. I walked the audience through the contents. I showed them the blank, completely unsigned donor pledge cards that had been falsely recorded as secured funds. I displayed the handwritten staging notes, proving that the senior director had spent hours meticulously plotting the seating arrangements of the wealthiest guests while completely ignoring the actual scholarship interviews. I presented undeniable physical proof that the entire foundation was nothing more than a hollow, heavily stylized public relations vehicle designed to elevate a single family's social standing at the direct expense of marginalized children. The auditorium completely erupted. The noise was deafening. Reporters were shouting questions over the furious demands of the betrayed benefactors. The parents of the defrauded students were standing up, their faces tight with pure, unadulterated rage. But the absolute largest, most desperate twist had not yet been unleashed. Seeing the undeniable physical evidence projected on the wall, seeing her wealthy peers looking at her with absolute disgust, Blair finally snapped. The immaculate, sweet philanthropic director completely disintegrated. She violently shoved her heavy wooden chair backward. It screeched horribly against the hardwood floor. She jumped to her feet, her face twisted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered fury. She completely abandoned her elegant posture and pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. She screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, fighting to be heard over the roaring chaos of the auditorium. She shrieked that the entire audit was a complete fabrication. She yelled to the board of trustees that I was not an impartial investigator, but a bitterly jealous, unhinged older sister. She screamed that I had been carrying a petty childhood grudge, and that I had deliberately waited 5 long years to orchestrate this exact moment simply to destroy my own family. The entire auditorium went dead silent. 300 pairs of eyes instantly snapped from the screaming girl in the front row directly up to me, waiting to see how the executioner would respond to the accusation of bad blood. I did not raise my voice to meet my sister's hysteria. The entire grand auditorium waited with bated breath for a screaming match, anticipating a dramatic reality television moment of bitter familial warfare. I simply stood behind the heavy wooden podium, adjusting the cuffs of my dark suit, and let her frantic, echoing accusations hang in the dead air. I looked down at her flushed, panicked face with complete clinical detachment. "I did not incorporate a fraudulent shell company," I said, my voice projecting clearly and steadily through the microphone, slicing through the heavy tension in the room. "I did not forge digital signatures on dozens of inflated vendor invoices. I did not manually wipe the main administrative server logs at 2 a.m. And I certainly did not wire hundreds of thousands of dollars of charitable scholarship funds to pay for the designer wardrobe hanging in your luxury apartment. My jealousy did not write those checks." "You did." Before Blair could muster another screaming denial, Judith Vale stepped up to the secondary microphone positioned at the edge of the stage. She announced to the board of trustees that forensic data was only one half of the firm's comprehensive investigation. She then called forward our final witness. A young woman walked slowly down the center aisle. She was the former program coordinator for the charity, a dedicated employee who had abruptly resigned 6 months prior because she could no longer stomach the daily deception. The coordinator stood before the assembly and testified under oath. She stated clearly that Elaine had explicitly ordered the administrative team to discard the applications of highly qualified, desperate students simply because they did not look polished enough to be photographed for the promotional brochures. She further testified that Grant had repeatedly instructed the staff to prioritize the luxurious, catered experience of the wealthy donors over the actual educational needs of the applicants, claiming the fund needed to maintain a distinctly high-class aesthetic to survive. That testimony was the absolute killing blow. It was one thing for the benefactors to learn their money had been stolen due to corporate greed or financial desperation. It was something entirely different, something profoundly unforgivable, to realize the genuine struggles of impoverished children had been exploited purely to manufacture a glamorous social aesthetic for a suburban family. The incredibly wealthy donors sitting in the audience were not just angry about their stolen capital. They were deeply, violently humiliated that they had been used as gullible props in my parents' desperate theater of status. The remaining fragile fragments of Blair's golden facade completely disintegrated right there in the front row. She collapsed back into her heavy wooden chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The pristine, confident executive vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified, wildly incompetent child who had finally been caught playing dress-up. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her voice echoing loudly over the room. She frantically confessed to the entire assembly that she had never understood how to run a real organization or manage an operating budget. She admitted she only knew how to select premium floral arrangements, host elegant dinners, and pose for flattering photographs. She cried that she had simply trusted her parents to handle the complicated numbers and fix whatever she broke, just as they had done for her entire privileged life. Elaine immediately lunged toward Blair, wrapping her arms around her daughter's shaking shoulders in a desperate, highly calculated attempt to perform the role of a fiercely protective, deeply victimized mother. She opened her mouth to speak, ready to spin a new, tearful web of excuses to the board, but the chairman of the board violently struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. His voice thundered through the speakers, ordering Elaine to sit down and remain completely silent. For the absolute first time in her pampered existence, my mother could not manipulate a room with her expensive clothes, her sweet perfume, or her demanding tone. She was entirely powerless, stripped bare in front of the exact people whose approval she valued above her own soul. The Board of Trustees did not even adjourn to a private chamber to deliberate. They executed a unanimous, public vote right there in the open auditorium. They voted to immediately freeze every single financial asset connected to the charity and the fraudulent consulting firm. They formally terminated the entire executive board, effective immediately. The university provost announced that all forensic auditing files were being transferred directly to civil litigators and the State Department of Financial Investigation. At a subtle nod from the chairman, 3 uniformed campus security officers stepped forward, positioning themselves directly behind Grant and Blair to detain them for preliminary questioning by the local authorities. The emergency session was officially dismissed into absolute chaos. As the crowd surged forward, shouting questions and demanding immediate legal action, Elaine managed to break away from the front row. She stumbled toward the side of the stage where I was quietly packing my final summary folder into my leather briefcase. Her perfectly tailored cream-colored suit was visibly wrinkled. Her immaculate posture was completely gone. She looked incredibly small, terrified, and suddenly very old. She reached out with a trembling hand, stopping just inches from my arm as if she were afraid to actually touch me. "Tessa," she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic vulnerability I had never once heard directed at me. "Please, you have to help us explain this. After everything, we are still family." I clicked the heavy brass locks of my briefcase shut. I turned to face the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless, unphotogenic outsider. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger, no bitter sorrow, and no petty triumph. There was just a profound, clinical emptiness. A real family does not steal their own child's discarded digital identity to register a fraudulent shell company, I replied, my voice perfectly level and devastatingly calm. And a real family does not swallow the educational futures of 41 desperate girls just to maintain a superficial social media image for their golden child. You are not my family. You are simply the subjects of my final audit report. I turned my back on her and walked down the side stairs of the stage. I navigated smoothly through the chaotic, shouting crowd of investigative reporters and furious benefactors. I did not look back over my shoulder a single time. I walked out of the heavy oak doors and into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. Behind me, the Mills family remained trapped in the center of the grand auditorium. They were finally experiencing the exact, terrifying reality they had always run from. The wealthy elite they had worshipped and courted their entire lives were currently looking down at them not as respected equals, but as the discarded criminal staff summoned to clean up a catastrophic mess of their own making. The legal fallout from my investigation was swift and absolutely brutal. The criminal indictments and civil asset forfeitures followed shortly after my final verified report was officially submitted to the state prosecutors. I did not attend any of their subsequent court hearings. I had already permanently closed their file. Instead, I used the massive career bonus I received from my firm, along with the formidable professional reputation I had cemented in the industry, to forge a completely new, unbreakable path forward. Naomi Ward and I partnered together to establish the Open Table Fellowship. We created a legitimate, fiercely protected, and transparently audited endowment fund dedicated exclusively to providing standardized testing fees, university application assistance, and rigorous career counseling for young women from extremely low-income backgrounds. I dedicated my life and my skills to ensuring that young girls who possessed raw, undeniable talent and relentless drive would never have to starve themselves or beg for basic support just to prove their worth to the world. I never once returned to my former suburban hometown to demand apologies, and I never sought any emotional closure from the people who shared my last name. I did not need to ask for a seat at their exclusive, conditional table anymore. I had successfully built my own table. It was infinitely wider. The foundation was forged from solid steel and undeniable truth, and it absolutely did not have any room for people who only knew how to love with conditions. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.